The barber shop fell silent except for the steady snip, snip, snip of scissors cutting through years of neglect. Frank's weathered hands moved with practiced precision around the scarred head of the most feared man in Block D. And for the first time in 20 years, Blade was telling someone about the father who never came back home. Frank Morrison had been counting his days at Oakwood Correctional Facility for exactly 892 days. Not because he was eager for release, he still had 18 months remaining on his sentence for tax evasion and filing false returns. He counted because routine had always been his anchor in chaos. In his previous life, routine had meant patrol schedules, case files, and the steady rhythm of investigation work that had defined 30 years as a police detective. Now, it meant surviving in a world where his former profession made him a target, and his age made him vulnerable. At 58, Frank carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen enough human darkness to understand that most evil came from pain rather than malice. His silver hair had grown longer than he'd worn it in decades. His hands showed the calluses of someone learning new trades, and his voice carried the measured tone of someone who had spent years asking questions that others were afraid to hear answered. Prison had not broken him, but it had taught him that strength sometimes looked like patience rather than resistance. Frank's crime had been almost mundane in its desperation. After retiring from the police force with a modest pension, he had opened a small barber shop in downtown Cleveland, using skills he'd learned from his father and grandfather. When his wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and needed specialized care that insurance wouldn't cover, Frank had started keeping two sets of books, one for the IRS and one that reflected the reality of cash payments from customers who couldn't afford regular prices. The investigation had been thorough, the prosecution merciless, and the judge had noted that former law enforcement officers should be held to higher standards when they violate the public trust. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent 3 decades arresting people for breaking the law had become a criminal himself. But Frank had learned that life rarely offered clear choices between right and wrong. More often it presented impossible situations where every option carried a cost that someone you loved would have to pay. He had chosen to pay that cost himself, accepting his sentence with the same stoic resolve that had carried him through 30 years of investigating humanity's failures. What he hadn't expected was how his background would affect his prison experience. Being a former cop in a facility filled with people he might have arrested created a unique form of isolation. He couldn't trust the guards, who saw him as a fallen colleague whose presence reminded them of their own vulnerabilities. He couldn't trust the inmates, many of whom had personal reasons to hate anyone who had ever worn a badge. He existed in a gray space between two worlds, accepted by neither, protected by none. For the first 8 months of his sentence, Frank had worked in the prison laundry, keeping his head down and avoiding attention. He had been threatened, tested, and occasionally targeted by inmates who wanted to settle old scores with law enforcement, but his quiet demeanor and obvious lack of resources had eventually made him uninteresting to most predators. He wasn't worth the trouble of hurting, and he wasn't valuable enough to exploit. He had achieved a kind of invisibility that many inmates would have envied. The opportunity to work in the barbershop had come unexpectedly. The previous barber, an elderly lifer named Santos, had died of a heart attack while cutting hair, and the prison needed someone with experience to take over the operation. Frank had mentioned during intake that he had barbering experience, a detail that had been buried in his file for almost 2 years before someone remembered it. The job came with slightly better pay, more regular hours, and the kind of routine that Frank's mind craved after months of chaotic uncertainty. The barber shop was a small, cramped space with 4 chairs, mirrors that had seen better decades, and equipment that Frank recognized from his own shop before he had been forced to modernize. But it was also something else, a neutral territory where the normal rules of prison hierarchy seemed to relax slightly. Men who wouldn't speak to each other in the yard could sit side by side waiting for haircuts. Enemies could occupy adjacent chairs without violence. There was something about the ritual of grooming, the vulnerability of sitting still while someone else held sharp instruments near your neck, that created a temporary suspension of hostilities. Frank approached his new job with the same methodical attention to detail that had made him a good detective. He learned each customer's preferences, remembered their stories, and gradually developed the kind of professional relationships that barbers had been building with their clients for centuries. But more than that, Frank discovered that the barber shop was becoming something he hadn't expected, a confessional where men could speak honestly about their lives without fear of judgment or exploitation. Frank had listened without interruption, recognizing the pain in Miguel's voice. When Miguel finished speaking, Frank had simply said, "That sounds like a smart little girl who loves her father very much. She's lucky to have someone who cares enough about being better for her that he's willing to admit his mistakes." It wasn't therapy, but it was healing. Miguel had never heard his situation described with such compassion while still acknowledging his responsibility for the choices that had separated him from his daughter. Word spread through the prison with the peculiar speed that characterized all significant developments in closed environments. The new barber actually listened to people's problems without trying to use their vulnerabilities against them later. Within weeks, Frank found that his appointment book was full and that men were scheduling haircuts more frequently than necessary, not because they needed grooming but because they needed someone to hear their stories. The conversations weren't limited to family problems. Men talked about their crimes, their regrets, their fears about returning to the outside world. They shared memories of who they had been before prison, dreams of who they hoped to become after release, and honest assessments of the choices that had brought them to this place. Frank listened to all of it with the same professional attention he had once brought to witness interviews and suspect interrogations, but without the adversarial context that had defined those interactions. James Wright, a 45-year-old man serving 15 years for armed robbery, had broken down crying while Frank cut his hair. "I used to be a carpenter," James had said through his tears. "Had my own business, employed 6 guys, built houses for families who couldn't afford the big contractors. I was good at it, took pride in creating something lasting, something beautiful. Then the recession hit. Work dried up and I started drinking to deal with losing everything I'd built. The drinking led to drugs. The drugs led to desperation. And the desperation led to that gas station on Elm Street where I pointed a gun at a kid who was just trying to pay for college." Frank had continued cutting hair while James spoke, his hands steady despite the emotional weight of the confession. When James finished, Frank had set down his scissors and met James's eyes in the mirror. "Sounds like you were a man who knew how to build things before you learned how to tear them down," Frank had said quietly. "The man who built houses is still in there. Maybe when you get out, he'll remember how to pick up a hammer instead of a gun." But Frank's growing reputation as someone who could provide emotional support while maintaining professional boundaries also attracted attention from quarters that were far less benign. Marcus Blade Williams had been the undisputed ruler of Block D for over 4 years. At 32, Blade stood nearly 6.5 feet tall with a lean, muscular build that spoke of someone who had survived through violence since childhood. His arms and torso were covered in tattoos that told the story of his rise through various gang organizations, and his face bore scars that served as warnings to anyone who might underestimate his willingness to use force to maintain his position. Blade had earned his nickname not because he carried knives, though he certainly knew how to use them, but because of his psychological approach to cutting people down. He could identify emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision, probe for psychological weaknesses through casual conversation, and use personal information as a weapon more devastating than any physical assault. His power came not just from his capacity for violence, but from his ability to make people hurt themselves through shame, fear, and isolation. What bothered Blade about Frank's barbershop conversations wasn't the activity itself, it was the way it was changing the emotional dynamics of Block D. Men who used to bring their problems to Blade, seeking his guidance or protection in exchange for loyalty and favors, were now spending their time with an old man who offered nothing but attention and understanding. The psychological control that Blade had spent years building was being undermined by someone who didn't seem to want anything in return for his services, someone who was creating bonds based on trust rather than fear. The confrontation was inevitable, and Blade chose his moment with the strategic thinking that had made him successful both on the streets and behind bars. He waited until the barbershop was empty except for Frank, who was cleaning his equipment at the end of the day shift. Blade entered without an appointment, flanked by 2 of his most trusted lieutenants, creating an intimidating presence that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. "Well, well, well," Blade announced, his voice carrying the casual menace that had intimidated countless inmates over the years. "If it isn't Block D's newest therapist, Frank the barber, right? I hear you've been providing some kind of counseling service along with your haircuts." Frank looked up from the scissors he was cleaning, his expression calm despite the obvious threat implicit in Blade's tone and the presence of his enforcers. "I cut hair," Frank said simply. "People talk while I work. I listen. That's about the extent of it." The response was delivered in the measured tone that Frank had used during thousands of police interviews, neither confrontational nor submissive, but factual and direct. Blade studied Frank's face, looking for signs of fear or deception that might guide his next move. "Listening," Blade repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "How therapeutic. But see, here's the thing, old man. In my experience, when someone starts collecting other people's secrets, it's usually because they plan to use those secrets for their own benefit later. Information is currency in here, and you've been accumulating quite a bank account." Frank continued cleaning his tools, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I'm not collecting secrets," he said calmly. "I'm listening to people who need someone to hear them. What they tell me stays between us. I don't repeat conversations, I don't judge what I hear, and I don't use personal information for any purpose except trying to understand how to be helpful. The reasonable tone of Frank's response only increased Blade's suspicion. In his experience, everyone had angles, everyone wanted something, everyone was running some kind of game. But this old man seemed to be telling the truth, which was somehow more threatening than any lie would have been. "You know what I think?" Blade said, stepping closer to Frank's chair. "I think you're running a long-term intelligence operation. Building trust, gathering information, mapping out the emotional landscape of this block so you can manipulate it later." "I understand why you might think that," Frank replied, setting down his scissors and turning to face Blade directly. "But I'm not gathering intelligence, and I'm not trying to manipulate anyone. I'm just trying to use whatever experience I have to help people feel less alone with their problems. If that bothers you, I'm willing to discuss how we might address your concerns." Blade's eyes narrowed as he processed Frank's calm acceptance of the confrontation. He had expected fear, defiance, or attempts at negotiation, responses he knew how to handle and exploit. But this steady acknowledgement of the threat while maintaining dignity was unfamiliar territory. "Let me explain something to you, ex-cop," Blade said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I run the emotional ecosystem in this block. When people have problems, they come to me. When they need guidance, they come to me. When they want someone to listen to their troubles, they come to me. Your little therapy sessions are disrupting my business." Frank nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering Blade's perspective. "I can see how my conversations with people might seem threatening to your position," he said, "but I'm curious about something. When people came to you with their emotional problems, did you find those interactions rewarding? Did helping them process their pain give you satisfaction? Or was it more about maintaining control and building loyalty?" The question caught Blade completely off guard. No one had ever asked him about his feelings regarding the psychological services he provided to other inmates. The truth was that listening to other people's problems had become burdensome and irritating over the years, but he had never admitted that to anyone, including himself. "That's not the point," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The point is that you're operating in my territory without permission." "What if there was a way for both of us to help people?" Frank asked quietly. "You obviously have leadership skills and organizational abilities that I lack. I have some experience with listening and understanding human behavior that you might find useful. Maybe the men in here need both kinds of support, and maybe we could provide it more effectively by working together than by competing with each other." Blade stared at Frank for a long moment, his mind racing as he tried to process this unexpected offer of collaboration. In his experience, power was finite. If someone else gained influence, it meant he was losing it. But Frank seemed to be suggesting something different, a model where different people could provide different kinds of value without threatening each other's positions. "What exactly are you proposing?" Blade asked, his voice cautious but intrigued. "I'm proposing that we both want to help people, just in different ways," Frank said. "You understand the practical realities of survival in here, how to stay safe, how to navigate conflicts, how to access resources and opportunities. I understand some things about listening and processing difficult emotions. Maybe the men in this block need both kinds of help, and maybe we could provide it better by acknowledging each other's strengths rather than seeing each other as threats." The suggestion hung in the air like a bridge connecting two different approaches to leadership. Blade had built his reputation on being the sole source of guidance and support for inmates under his protection. But Frank was suggesting that real strength might involve recognizing when other people had skills that could complement your own, when sharing responsibility might actually increase everyone's effectiveness rather than diminishing it. "Why would you want to work with me?" Blade asked, his voice smaller than it had been since the conversation began. "You know what I am, what I've done to people. You know I'm dangerous and that most people are afraid of me. Why would someone like you want to partner with someone like me?" Frank was quiet for a moment, understanding that his answer would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation but potentially the future relationship between them and the emotional climate of the entire block. "Because I think you became dangerous as a way of protecting yourself and the people you care about," Frank said finally. "And I think underneath all that armor there's someone who genuinely wants to help people but never learned how to do it without using fear and control." The observation hit Blade like a physical blow. Frank had seen through years of carefully constructed intimidation to something that Blade himself had almost forgotten existed, the part of him that had originally wanted to be a protector rather than a predator, the part that had chosen power as a defense against powerlessness, the part that had learned to hurt others before they could hurt him but had never stopped wanting connection instead of isolation. "You don't know anything about me," Blade said, but his voice was breaking as he spoke. You don't know where I came from or what I've had to do to survive or what people have done to me. Frank leaned back in his chair slightly, his expression filled with the kind of patient attention that Blade hadn't experienced since childhood. You're right, I don't know your specific story, Frank said gently, but I recognize pain when I see it, and I can tell that you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. If you want to tell me about it, I'll listen. If you don't, that's fine too. But either way, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. The offer of unconditional support without demands or expectations broke something inside Blade that had been held together by willpower and rage for over 2 decades. Tears began forming in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain his threatening demeanor. My name isn't really Blade, he said through the emotion that was overwhelming his voice. It's Marcus. Marcus Williams. And I haven't told anyone my real name in so long that sometimes I forget who I was before I became this. Frank nodded, understanding the significance of this revelation. Hello, Marcus. I'm Frank. Thank you for trusting me with your real name. That took courage. The simple acknowledgement seemed to open emotional floodgates that had been sealed for years. Marcus began talking, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if he was afraid this opportunity to be honest might disappear if he didn't seize it immediately. He told Frank about growing up with a father who disappeared when Marcus was 8 years old, leaving him alone with a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. He described learning to shave himself because there was no man around to teach him, figuring out how to tie his shoes and ride a bike and throw a baseball through trial and error, and the occasional kindness of neighbors who felt sorry for the kid who never had anyone show up to his school events. Marcus talked about his first fight at 10 years old, when older boys tried to take his lunch money, about discovering that being feared was easier than being ignored, about the slow progression from schoolyard defender to street enforcer to prison kingpin. He explained how he had learned that people respected strength and despised weakness, that showing vulnerability was an invitation for others to hurt you, that the safest way to live was to make sure everyone around you was more afraid of you than you were of them. But the thing is, Frank, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, I never wanted to be scary. When I was little, before everything went wrong, I wanted people to like me. I wanted friends who chose to be around me because I made them feel good, not because they were afraid of what I might do to them if they left. I used to imagine having someone who would care if I was hurt, who would miss me if I was gone, who would be happy to see me just because of who I was, not because of what I could do for them. Frank listened without interruption, recognizing the profound courage it was taking for Marcus to share these buried longings and regrets. When Marcus finished speaking, Frank was quiet for a long moment, understanding that his response would determine whether this conversation became a turning point or just another disappointment in a lifetime filled with them. That little boy who wanted to be liked is still inside you, Marcus, Frank said finally. All these years you've been protecting him the only way you knew how. But maybe it's time to consider whether there might be other ways to keep him safe. Ways that don't require you to become someone you never really wanted to be. The suggestion hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. You really think I could be different? Marcus asked, his voice filled with hope and terror in equal measure. You really think someone like me could learn to be gentle instead of scary? I think you've already been gentle, Frank replied. Every time you've protected someone weaker, every time you've provided guidance to someone lost, every time you've created order out of chaos, that was gentleness disguised as strength. The question isn't whether you can be gentle. The question is whether you're ready to let people see that gentleness without fear that they'll use it against you. Over the following weeks, an extraordinary transformation began to take place in the barbershop and throughout Block D. Marcus didn't abandon his position as a leader, but he started using his influence differently. Instead of ruling through fear and intimidation, he began protecting Frank's operation, ensuring that the barbershop remained a safe space where men could be vulnerable without risk of exploitation or ridicule. Most remarkably, Marcus began participating in the conversations that happened in Frank's chair. He would share his own experiences with abandonment and survival, offering perspectives that only someone who had lived through similar struggles could provide. His willingness to be honest about his pain gave other men permission to acknowledge their own wounds, creating a ripple effect of emotional honesty that transformed the culture of Block D. Frank taught Marcus basic listening techniques, how to ask questions that open conversations rather than shutting them down, how to sit with someone's pain without immediately trying to fix it, how to reflect back what he heard without adding judgment or advice. Marcus taught Frank about the complex social dynamics of prison life, which conflicts were brewing before they became visible, how to recognize signs of mental health crises, how to navigate the unwritten rules that govern daily survival. Together, they developed what inmates began calling the chair, Not just a place to get haircuts, but a sanctuary where men could speak honestly about their fears, hopes, and dreams without having their vulnerabilities used against them later. Marcus's presence ensured that these conversations remained protected, while Frank's skills helped participants process their emotions in constructive ways. The transformation in Marcus was remarkable to witness. The man who had ruled through fear began demonstrating a different kind of leadership, one based on protection rather than predation, on understanding rather than judgment, on helping people find their own strength rather than forcing them to submit to his. He still commanded respect from other inmates, but now that respect was earned through his willingness to be vulnerable and his commitment to creating safety for others rather than through his capacity for violence. 6 months after their first confrontation, Marcus approached Frank with a request that would have been unthinkable when they first met. "Frank, I've been thinking about something you said about that little boy inside me who wanted to be liked. I know I can't go back and change how I grew up, but there are young guys coming in here who remind me of myself at that age. Would you help me figure out how to be the kind of person for them that I wish someone had been for me?" Frank smiled, recognizing the profound significance of Marcus's request. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Marcus. And I think you might be surprised by how much of that person you already are. You've been protecting people, providing guidance, creating stability. Now you want to do it with kindness instead of fear. The skills transfer more easily than you might think." They started working with younger inmates who were struggling to adapt to prison life, teaching them not just how to survive physically, but how to maintain their humanity in a dehumanizing environment. Marcus would share practical knowledge about staying safe and navigating conflicts, while Frank would help process the emotional challenges of separation from family, fear about the future, and shame about the choices that had led to incarceration. Marcus discovered that he had natural gifts for mentorship, particularly with men who had experienced abandonment and neglect similar to his own. He understood their anger about absent fathers, their confusion about how to be strong without being cruel, their desperate hunger for approval from older men who might see value in them. His own transformation from feared enforcer to protective mentor gave his students hope that they too could choose different paths than the ones that had brought them to prison. When Frank was released after serving his full sentence, he left behind more than just a successful barbershop operation. He had helped create a culture where emotional honesty was valued over false toughness, where helping others was seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness, where the most respected leader in the facility was someone who had learned to lead through service rather than fear. Marcus still had 6 years remaining on his sentence, but he spent that time differently than he had spent the previous 4 years of incarceration. He continued expanding the mentorship program, working with prison administrators to develop new approaches to rehabilitation that focused on addressing trauma and building emotional intelligence rather than just punishment and containment. He also maintained the barbershop as a space where men could continue to find the kind of acceptance and understanding that had transformed his own life. 3 years after Frank's release, Marcus sent him a letter written in careful handwriting that showed the results of literacy classes he had started attending. "Frank," the letter read, "I wanted to tell you about something that happened today. A kid came in, 18 years old, first time in prison, crying because he was scared and didn't know how to survive in here. 5 years ago, I would have seen him as weak and either ignored him or used his fear to make him dependent on me. Instead, I sat him down in your chair and listened while he told me about the mistakes that brought him here and the family he was afraid he'd never see again. When he finished talking, I told him that being scared didn't make him weak, it made him human. And being human was exactly what he needed to stay if he wanted to go home as someone his family could be proud of. Thank you for teaching me that the strongest thing a man can do is admit when he needs help and then help others do the same." Frank kept that letter on his bathroom mirror in the small apartment where he lived after his release, a reminder that the most important conversations often happen not in therapy offices or counseling centers, but in ordinary spaces where one person chose to really listen to another. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is someone who has never felt heard, never felt understood, never felt valued for anything except their capacity to cause harm. And sometimes all it takes to transform a life is a comfortable chair, some basic tools, and someone willing to see past the armor to the human being underneath. The strongest walls are not made of concrete and steel. They are built from silence, shame, and the belief that some people are too damaged to deserve gentleness, too far gone to change, too dangerous to trust with compassion. But Frank Morrison learned in that prison barbershop that every wall can be dismantled one conversation at a time, one moment of genuine attention at a time, one act of seeing someone's full humanity at a time. Because when you give someone a safe place to tell their truth, you don't just change their story, you help them remember who they were before the world taught them to hide behind fear, and who they might become if someone believes they deserve a second chance to be gentle.